Hello everybody and welcome to this webinar on Digital by Default, Opportunities and Risks for the COVID-19 Generation. This event is part of the LSE Festival 2021, Shaping the Post-COVID World, and the webinar and the festival runs all this week. My name is Sonia Livingstone. I'm a professor in the Department of Media and Communications here. And among other things, I coordinate the Global Kids Online project with UNICEF, the Children Online project with colleagues in Europe, and the Digital Futures Commission with the Five Rights Foundation. And I'm really delighted to be chairing this event today. We're recording and live streaming this session, as I expect you have noticed, and we're going to include time for audience participation. So do please put your questions in the Q&A box and we will come to them in a bit. So as we all know, among the many other shocks and transformations of the past year, COVID-19 transformed society's reliance on digital technologies as the infrastructure for education, health, family, work, and much more. Almost overnight, following lockdown, children's lives became digital by default. Infrastructures, of course, are taken for granted, necessary, the means by which vital activities become possible. But digital infrastructures are far from unproblematic, and they don't always serve our interests. In the last year, we've heard a lot about the so-called COVID generation, and few of us thought we'd be still thinking about this generation 1 year later, that we'd still be locked down. It seems to me really timely to ask some of our big questions about children and young people's experiences, the difficulties they've encountered, maybe some good things to come out of it all. And it's time to listen to children and young people's calls for change. Will we, should we go back to how things were before? Or is this the perfect moment to research, reflect, and demand change? Crucially, the spotlight has been on digital inequalities and exclusion as children and young people have especially had their education online, but many other aspects of their lives. There's been attention to data and privacy issues, a lot of thought about the wholesale adoption of EdTech, including Zoom, of course, as we are using today. And concern about digitally facilitated forms of aggression and exploitation, as well as unmet mental health needs. At the same time, our digital lives bring some pleasures and new possibilities, and young people are often in the vanguard of exploring those, figuring out how to learn. I've heard young people playing hide and seek on Zoom, learning how to access and research the family's pressing needs for reliable health information, staying in touch with friends through gaming, even becoming digital activists. Earlier on in this past COVID year, child rights organisations sprang into action, as did researchers working with children and young people. And once everyone had figured out how to do research and consultation during lockdown, which was not so easy, some really fascinating projects got underway. Of course, not all of them are focused on digital technologies, but none could ignore the digital dimension of young people's lives. This is a global pandemic that we're living through, and experiences vary hugely around the world in ways that we, I think, are yet to understand. So today we've invited expert speakers involved with 4 cross-national research projects to reflect critically on what can be learned from their research about children and young people's experiences, needs and rights, and how they could be better served in a digital world. Konstantinos Papachristou is the youth lead in the COVID-19 Life Under Coronavirus Global Research Project, and he's the creator of Teens for Greece, an online forum for young people to express their ideas to help Greece. The COVID-19 project, led by Kristen Hope-Birchall at Terre des Hommes, has organised a host of children's rights and research organisations, including Global Kids Online, among many others, to realise the promise of Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is to ensure that children across the globe are meaningfully involved in the discussion about the response to the pandemic. Maya Göetz is head of the International Central Institute for Youth and Educational Television at the Bavarian Broadcasting Corporation and of the Prix Jeunesse Foundation. In the early days of the pandemic, she designed and coordinated an international study in 42 countries that inquired into children's perception of the corona crisis, their knowledge of COVID-19, and the role that the media play in this. As I think she'll discuss with us, the Children, Media and COVID-19 report revealed the role of media as a source of information and a crucial lifeline to the world. Patricio Cuevas-Parra is Director of Child Participation and Rights at World Vision International and a children's rights advocate. I think his report on children's voices in times of COVID was the first one I read on children and young people's experiences last year, at a time when children seemed almost unnoticed in terms of discussion of the impacts of the pandemic. His focus is on children as young activists, as people who want to respond and who have acted in many ways over the past year, which is a refreshing in a world where adults mainly expect to provide for, but not hear from children. Laurie Day, our final speaker, is a director at Ecoris UK, leading on research for children, young people and families. And he has a current project for the European Commission on the role of digital tools in supporting inclusive education across Europe, and a project that I've been a little involved with by the Nuffield Foundation, Growing Up Under COVID-19, exploring the social impacts of COVID-19 with young action researchers in 4 very different countries. In a moment, I'm going to ask the speakers to address my first question so we can discover what they've found in their research. But first, I have a question for everyone in the audience, and I believe we're going to present a poll. So forgive this slightly simple question, but we would love to get your views. Whether on balance, digital technologies have made children's lives better, worse, or not made much difference during COVID-19. I realize I don't know how we get the results of the poll. Maybe someone is going to tell me them in a little while. But thank you for answering. And if you haven't answered already, please do. I'm sure we'll figure out the results in a moment. So I'm going to organize oh, there we go. All right, we have a bunch of optimists in the Zoom room. Just about on balance, people listening think digital technologies have made children. Maybe we can't quite imagine a pandemic without the digital. That's a question, a thought to conjure with. But interestingly, a third think it's made things worse. No one really thinks it's not made much difference. So we have a slightly kind of polarized audience listening to us, and that I think helps us focus on the research that we're now going to hear about. So I have a very straightforward question to our 4 panelists to get things going. I'm going to ask them to keep their remarks fairly short, kind of 3 minutes max for each. And I would just love to hear, based on the research that they've each been involved in, what have been the consequences for children of the sudden reliance on the internet triggered by the pandemic? I'm going to ask the speakers in turn, but please feel free to put questions in the Q&A as we go. And I'm going to start, if I may, with Konstantinos. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's definitely a very interesting question, especially in the times we're living in. And in order to answer that, I think I'll go back to the history a bit of COVID-19. So COVID-19 actually started back in April, in the early days of the pandemic. And it was created actually by Terdizon. And the main idea behind it was that children from all over the world were going through this pandemic, and there wasn't something that would amplify their voices and raise awareness about their experiences. So COVID-19 tried to do that. So what we initially did was to launch the Life Under Coronavirus survey. That is a global survey aimed for children between the age of 8 to 17, and it was translated to 27 different languages along an easy read version so that children from all backgrounds could take part in it. At the end of the survey, we achieved actually to make the largest global survey based on the experience of children during this pandemic, and also to be the survey that used a child rights participatory approach. This survey was developed in collaboration with our international partners, such as, for example, the Queen's University of Belfast, the LSE, and the Office of the Special Representative, the Secretary General on Violence Against Children. And we also work with a diverse group of young people from more than 28 countries. I think that during this pandemic, there's been a substantial lack of information that was made in a child language or in a child-friendly format. And many children mentioned that in their survey, and especially in the times that they were experiencing from school closures, confinement, isolation, they felt the need to express that. And because in COVID-19, we truly believe that the experiences these children are going through are very unique, and each individual should have a platform, something that they're able to express their experiences, express their ideas. We managed to do that. So I would like to read something that a 14-year-old girl from Costa Rica said. In the survey, she said, "Now, more than ever, teenagers are suffering from anxiety. We have to do too much work for school. My eyebrows began to fall off because I'm so worried I won't pass my course. There are many who think about suicide. Some demand too much from us. I have no internet connection and can't talk to my friends. That makes me feel very depressed. I feel bad for not being able to see my family and friends." So we're seeing testimonies from children all around the world asking for things to change, asking for a platform for people to listen, politicians to listen. And I think in this way, maybe the internet could be something that could empower and allow the children to share their views, share their experiences. But at the same time, that may be easy in a way, maybe in a place of privilege, because we mostly assume that we are all digital by default. But that is not actually the case for all people around the world. In our survey, 44% from certain parts of the world, such as Africa, mentioned that they were not able to access the internet when they had to, such as, for example, when they had to join their online classes or when they had to speak to their friends. We also tried to work with children from detention center, refugee camps, and homeless centers, and 62% of them said that they had no access at all or hardly any access to internet. While at the same time, migrant asylum seekers had significantly lower access, between 38% and 27% specifically. And I think it's so important that we build infrastructure that will help these children and use platforms and spaces to amplify their voices and share their experiences. And it's really important to understand that not everyone is in the same situation, and each people is going through a very difficult time. Or, I mean, some people were finding it a bit easier. Maybe they were spending more time with their parents. That's something that was quite interesting. But it's definitely a very hard time, and especially when children and young people feel isolated, we should do something about it and use the internet to help them.
Brilliant. Konstantinos, thank you very much. You have begun with in a somber mood, and I think rightly so, reflecting the many things that you've heard in the project from children often living under very difficult circumstances, in circumstances where technology could have helped a lot more, but hasn't been there when needed. So thank you for that. I'm going to turn to Maya Göetz for a view from the project on children, COVID and media.
Thank you very much. Well, to answer your question very flat, children had to become media literate in a very short time. Of course, a lot of them already know how to use the techniques and where to find the right programs and how to control their media use in a healthy way. But especially, for example, if I'm talking about Germany, quite a lot did not. So they had to come media literate in a very short time, and of course, especially their teachers, which was the biggest lag in international comparison in Germany. Something, again, just from Germany, in Germany, we have a very media critical public discourse. So the press, everyone normally says they shouldn't watch television, they shouldn't watch too much computer. And suddenly now everything turned around. Now computer was the only way, the internet, how to get access, how to meet friends, and actually was the only hope for parents to survive the home office plus children at home. So the bad thing suddenly becomes the good thing, which made some very interesting change in how we discuss media here. What gets very obvious in Germany is the gap between the ones who have not only fast internet, but also who have enough devices. Because if both parents are in home office and there are 2 or 3 siblings in the house, it gets very crowded. And this gap come even more clearer if you look at the international study. We are a study in 42 countries where you clearly could see it. If you talk about the differences, one is on the country level. There are countries who have nearly no internet, like Cuba, where you just have internet on certain spots and it's very expensive, or Democratic Republic of Congo, where not everywhere has internet. So it was really interesting to do research there, because then we are back at paper. So they had questionnaires which they filled out. So on country level, it really makes a difference if they have the possibility to get access. And then the other thing which got clear is on family level. If the family has the possibilities, how much they could share it with their children or need it for their own access. And of course, then on children's level, how much they could deal with it. What was clear, or what we got out of it, children and teenagers used media for contact. It was the only way how they could share the opportunities, how they can share and at least have a little bit of feeling that they are not so alone. And especially for the teens, this really was important. We also, as we have heard, had about 20% in the teen study who were in a depressive phase and really had a hard time. They use it for school, for information, to get information, for example, on COVID. They also described it as escape, to just forget for a moment the world around and hope and just the time pass by, that things get normal again. And they use it to cope with their feelings. So they are, we asked them, how do you deal with the situation? And then media was a very central point, how they deal with bad mood, with too much energy, with whatever. So media really become a big part of their life and how they could cope with their emotions.
Brilliant, thank you. Something very important, I mean, many very important points. I think one about, for those of us who often think about digital literacy or media literacy, suddenly we see how very important it is to be able to just manage and interpret and be critical of all of this technology. But I think, as both you and Konstantinos are pointing out, the question of the infrastructure and the provision and questions of inclusion, yeah, are just very... There's no point understanding the technology if you can't access it. So Patricio Cuevas-Parra, can I turn to you? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I conducted a research at the beginning of the pandemic last year in February, March, April, where, as you mentioned, there were children voices that were absent from the global discourse in terms of COVID-19. So there were 2 situations at that time that we perceived. One was an adult-centered response from a programmatic level, but as well policy level, and children that were absent or they were victimized, where we tried to find out what's happening with them, where are the voices, what are the opinion, perceptions. So I did a research in about 12 countries. So for instance, I talked to children from Nicaragua, Peru, Brazil, Ghana, Kenya, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Mongolia, Bangladesh, etc. And one thing that was the same across all the countries was the lack of access to internet, and the schools shut down from one day to another day without any warning. Most of the country claim, they say, now we are moving to home online education, school will be open, all the children will have access, but many of the children told us that never happened. For instance, in Peru, one of the participants said, they told us the school is closed one day, next day we were at home with no communication at all with the school, and during a month, they didn't have any class, anything. No homework, no communication with the school teacher, etc. They say, like Maya, when she mentioned about DRC and Democratic Republic of Congo, children mentioned exactly the same. They didn't have any access to internet. But on the other hand, for instance, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Romania, they have access. But they were very exhausting for them, very kind of a lot of pressure. But as well, they said those children from rural areas, they were not able to join the classes. So the whole situation exacerbated inequalities, where inequality was already something, a major problem in the communities. When I asked them about the perceptions in terms of if they are listened to, none of them said they were listened to, nor in the school, nor in the community, nor in the family. But at the same time, they say that most of them are more educated than their parents. They have access to internet, better access to information. So they were those passing information to others about COVID, about the measures, about what kind of thing they can do or not do. And many of them as well become activists during this time, or they were activists before, but not in this topic. And they start doing some online sessions, webinars, Facebook Live, to keep a good moral among the peers, but as well teaching them. In Bangladesh, children and young people, they did Facebook Live with more than 1,000 participants. And they were just talking about that, answering questions, and then become so sophisticated, they start inviting public figures, external speakers, children from other countries. That was a very empowering element within the tragedy. So I think there are many learnings of that. So children know just the victims, so they don't want to be labeled as that. They are agents of change, they are competent social actors, and they can help others in need. That was one of the key findings. So something positive within the tragedy.
Very good, thank you. And I really appreciate hearing about young people as activists, as actors in this world. It amazes me how often I go to events where people talk about children, but not with them, or consulting them, or indeed treating them as actors in this world. So thank you. Laurie Day, thank you. Would you like to share the results of your research in very different countries?
Certainly. Thank you, Sonia. Yes, so just listening to the presentations today. So the Growing Up Under COVID-19 study, our focus was particularly on 14 to 18-year-olds, so youth rather than young children. And it was transnational, but I guess located in the global north. So we are doing research in the UK, Italy, Lebanon, and Singapore. So in terms of the consequences of the pandemic for young people, we looked at three main areas. The first one of this was the implications for young people's everyday lives and the people around them. So really the more personal actions that they were taking. The second was young people's perceptions of how the crisis is being managed and the decisions that are being made largely on their behalf, as it turned out in a lot of cases. And then the third was the media and public response element. So all three interlocking. And I think what came through really strongly was that internet and social media cut across all three of these themes, inescapably so during the pandemic period. But I think a couple of things particularly stood out because of the methodology that we adopted. So we were using participatory action research. So we were working with young people as co-researchers through the project, as well as them being the subjects of the research. And I think two things really stood out. The first one was, again, this sense of young people's agency being the really underreported aspect of the crisis to date. So young people very much being portrayed on the one hand as victims of school closures, and then the next minute as the villains who are out breaching social distancing rules. But actually what was really clear from the research is that young people have been actively responding and adapting both on and offline all the way through the crisis, kind of behind the scenes, away from the public eye. The second was that young people's experiences of the crisis really varied considerably according to personal circumstances, and there was some really sharp contrasts within the project. So what for some was an extremely challenging period, for others, to some extent, was actually quite liberating, despite the seriousness of the wider public health emergency. And for young people on the project themselves as well, we're acutely aware of these contradictions. So looking specifically in terms of young people's digital lives, as Sonia mentioned, there were opportunities and risks sort of bound up together. So starting with the positives, what came through quite strongly was the way in which young people were quite often using the opportunity afforded by lockdown to reinvest in their self-care and their well-being. So with the social distancing came the lifting of these social and academic pressures that many young people had. And this created a space for them to really reflect on what's important. So during this time, many had used the internet as an outlet for creativity, for self-expression, whether through diaries, music, or in some cases, researching their faith or their heritage, for example. There's also a really interesting work around reinvention of relationships and social networks. So young people had often prioritized friendships that were meaningful outside of the context of school. And this meant the emergence of new friendship groups online. And this got really interesting as schools started to unlock, and there were moral dilemmas around sort of who were within these groups, responding to social distancing and so forth. Young people had also developed a much better radar for spotting fake news and for triangulating different sources of media and channels during the lockdown period, and they were taking social action. So again, that came through very strongly from our research too. Inevitably, there was a flip side to this as well. So I think firstly, there were some question marks about the responsiveness of services moving online, so disrupted education, but also disrupted healthcare. And sadly as well, examples of professionals disappearing under the cover of lockdown and really not being held accountable. And secondly, I think more time online inevitably meant that there were heightened exposures to risks and harms, whether that was experienced by young people personally, but also through what they had discovered through their own research in relation to their peers as well. And I think, as Patricio was saying, particular issues for young people who were already experiencing vulnerabilities prior to the crisis, such as poor mental health, poverty, or family conflict. This was very much compounded by a situation of being in isolation and having to deal with these privacy issues. So a mixed picture, I guess, the good, the bad, and the ugly as well, but a lot more nuanced and a lot more complex than has been portrayed in the media during the crisis.
Brilliant, thank you, Laurie. Absolutely. I really appreciate that everyone's responses are, of course, much more nuanced, and rightly so, than the original kind of poll question that we asked the audience. Of course, technologies offer many risks and opportunities in ways that are complex and depend on the context and, if you like, the situations in which children and young people found themselves when lockdown first arrived. I appreciate that you've all kind of explained a little about the project, and I think what folks listening will have heard is the way in which these research projects, which of course had to be got off the ground very quickly in ways that are ethical and ambitious in the number of countries that are spanned. Everyone has taken the kind of, made the effort and figured out the ways to do it, the research in a way that's participatory, that is with children, not about children, that is including young people. I know in the COVID-19 project, not only including children for data collection, but also in the data analysis and interpretation of the messages. I think the different projects have kind of engaged young people in different ways. And that helps, I think, in kind of moving us from questions about research and research findings to consultation about for how things should change. And I think each of you in some way has kind of hinted at what should change or been suggested a range of things that should change. I'm going to ask you each if you could distill a kind of range of calls. So maybe everyone say kind of one or two things that should change, so that we get a kind of a different a range of things on our agenda. And I don't know if it's possible also to say, who should be the agents of change. It's easy to is one thing to call for change. It's another to say, do children want to speak their message to government, to the digital industry to local communities, or the messages for parents. You know, there's lots of agents. Konstantinos, let me start with you. What do you feel are the kind of the priorities that emerge from the COVID-19 project, and maybe who are the agents that should step up and make things better?
I mean, I think generally there are a lot of definitely issues that are coming up. I mean, more generally, I would say we're seeing global inequalities, especially now with the vaccine race. It has become a lot more prominent. And in a way, it's creating a divide of two worlds, with countries, for example, the UK or the US stocking up on vaccines, and countries, for example, such as certain parts of the world, such as Asia, for example, lacking on vaccine access till 2024, 2023. So you have countries with accelerated growth and countries that are lagging behind in years of process. And I think that we need to understand that this should be a global process, and it should come from all governments, all institutions, all the NGOs to work together for equal access to information, to vaccines, better education. And I think during this time, as individuals as well as societies, if something positive happened out of COVID, is that we truly understood what matters in life and why we live, which is our families, our friends, traveling, living. And I think that's something we should take forward and incorporate more into our life after the pandemic. But I mean, children during the survey were speaking a lot about hope after the post-pandemic world, but also about hardship and anger. So I would like to share some more quotes. Actually, I'll share my screen now on what some children said from parts of the world, because I think it's very important to amplify their voices and listen to what they said. So starting from a 17-year-old girl from the Philippines, she said, "A huge number of children are more and more becoming victims of the intensive digital learning and poverty. During these times, the parents of children are losing their jobs. Many households are unable to have food to eat. Many do not afford to even support their family needs. And many do not have access to the internet and technological devices. Many children will be left behind." Again, it's a topic of countries and people being left behind. I think it's very crucial to address that. Another girl from Myanmar said, "Due to social distancing, we hardly go out. We need entertainment and play. If our government can stream a free, child-friendly, eco-friendly version of Kids TV channel, in this way, children can still enjoy their time at home. But right before that, the government must make sure every child in the country has access to electricity. Please." And we're starting to see, in a way, a process of bringing and bridging the gap that is created by the digital divide. And it's a huge issue, especially if we move forward and forward into a more technologically advanced society. And we should really address that even now. Very important, especially for children that are disadvantaged. And I think another issue that arises from that question of technological advancement is also the freedom of expression and how views are considered and how we can use social media to use that. In our survey, only 20% of children felt that they were listened by the governments. And obviously governments are a huge agent of change. And I think social media also have a part in this. Social media have been shown in the past years, and in the past 10 years, they've become a lot more prominent, that they're so powerful tools of expression, so powerful tool for politics, and so powerful for people to share their experiences. And maybe we should start seeing social media platforms take a more ethical side and promoting ideas as such. I think that's very important, and even they are huge agents of change that we should look at. And I think the last one, in terms of moving forward to the new digital age and providing a better understanding, would be having support to get reliable information and access to information in general. And even though we think we're becoming digital by default, in our survey, we discovered that most children, around 62% of the children that took part in the survey, trust their parents still as a primary source of information. And I think that it has two sides, actually. I mean, we're seeing a huge anti-vax movement, which is, especially in our times, very scary. I mean, it's delaying the effort and everything. So I think informing the parents and the children, obviously, as well, starting from education, starting from the internet, starting from social media, from the governments, would also be in child-friendly language is very important. So in terms of agents of change, I would say governments, the children themselves even can be agents of change. Schools, social media, and generally internet agencies, I think, are very important as well. And obviously international organizations such as WHO, the United Nations.
Absolutely, all of them. All of them. We often call for a kind of coordinated action across all the different stakeholders. Sometimes I worry that that means that everyone can point the finger at someone else that ought to kind of lead the way, and not enough happens. Konstantinos, you are very eloquent in what should change. In a way, what is sad is that we kind of knew this a year or two ago, but it didn't happen. And now we have been caught in a situation where it is just so vital that that we address the questions of inequalities and privacy and safety and opportunity in this digital world. So maybe now it is higher on the agenda. Maya, you said something that that rang true with me at the start of your talk. You said families have been so against technology in many ways, too much screen time, and suddenly everything was screen time. But I think we've also heard in some ways from panelists that Konstantinos said this too, we also recognize we cannot live in a completely media world. We do need to get out, see our friends, breathe the fresh air. I just wonder whether you could distill your research in terms of messages, a call for media organizations, whom I know you work with, and try to kind of think, how could they play a better role in their responsibilities towards young people?
Wonderful bridge, because one of the really interesting findings of the study, we asked more than 4,200 kids in 42 countries, and we asked them what they know about the coronavirus, and we confronted them with some fake news. So, and what we found is, and on another part of the questionnaire, we asked them, how much are you personally worried about the coronavirus? And what we found is that children who are informed, who know a lot about the coronavirus and can identify fake news, are very much worried. So it's very important that they have information which speak to them. So they need children's television. And you clearly could see a difference. For example, UK was one of the top countries where children really know a lot about the coronavirus. And the Philippines, we just heard it, they had nearly no knowledge. So it's the fear was there. They didn't know how to deal with it. And in another part of the study, we did qualitative interviews with children in refugees on forced migration. So refugee camps in Syria still, or in refugee shelter. And there got obvious, very clear lack, because most of them didn't have any information in their own language. So they were really on fear. Some of the families didn't go out for 2 months because they thought the war has arrived, in Luxembourg in this case. So it's really, we have to think about what languages do the children speak in the country, and how could we give them some access. And just one little other finding, we also asked them, okay, sometimes media can really help, and now it's really important, but sometimes it can get too much. How do you shape, how do you control your media usage? And the interesting finding was the ones where they just said, well, my parents control it. They tell me what to watch and what not to watch. They don't have any more competencies, while the children and the teens who said, well, I have to take care of myself, and I find this way, this way, this way, this way. And they had a lot of competencies how to control the media consumption. So a clear ask for, or a clear plus for more competencies for the children, because especially in those times, they need to know how to control media usage themselves.
Yes, Yes, absolutely. I think I do hope that if digital literacy was not on the agenda of governments before, it absolutely needs to be now. But I think also, as you say, there are also questions about what the media should provide, what they can do. They're often very powerful organizations. Patricio, I'm thinking about the role of children as agents for change when lockdown is over, or even now during lockdown. How can their actions be better recognized as we kind of call on all of these different agencies and stakeholders to try to learn from this experience and respond to some calls?
Yeah, I think the first is to have a clear position that children have the right to participate and to be listened to in this society. If that right is having always prevented in different ways, or having tokenistic, not sustainable, or having more consultation or dialogue, no influence in decision making. It's a list of consistent challenges all over the time, across different countries, region, etc. But for instance, my research engaged with 12 children and young people as my co-researchers, which was essential to succeed in my research. So there were not any possibility to do fieldwork. I couldn't travel to any country. Our contact people in different countries, they couldn't leave the office or couldn't leave. But the children, they live in the community. So they were able to interview their peers, sometimes via WhatsApp, Facebook, talking in the street, or when they gather in some safe places. So that shows that when we have this intergenerational cooperation with children and young people, like in a research, this can be done. As I was able to do it, reach a number of children and involve them in the decision-making process and analysis, and then become as well a group, my advisory group. So this need to change, because we see families, schools, churches, any religious leader, policymaker, etc., and all different levels, from the local, very local community until the global stakeholder, still is a resistance to listen to children and to treat them as a competent social actor. So I think that's the first thing they need to change. And children have proof they have the ability and they have the will to engage in social change. And if they can mobilize their peer for actions that they believe are very important. Most of the children I interview are from very deprived communities, very vulnerable families, but they were always worried about other people that were more vulnerable with them, or people have no access to internet, no information, so they were always thinking how can reach them. So my call today is to ask everybody in power, but power from community to the global to national countries, is to listen to children, take them seriously, but it's not just to console them. It's how to take their ideas into account and how to report back to them how we have been their ideas used in decision making. That process is very difficult. The listen is the easy step, but take into account and provide feedback if that should be sustainable is way more difficult. So, but I think COVID-19 provides certain opportunities, a lot of challenges, but the opportunity is that they prove they want to do many things. And I saw as well some webinars organized by children and young people, just to meet other children from the country, talk about their problems. So they were able to mobilize others to interact and make something happen. Thank you.
Fantastic. I think you're making me think, Patricio, that in a way, COVID has been hard, lockdown has been hard, but now, as someone said earlier, we kind of know what needs doing. And so in a sense, the hard work really does begin now. And it could be enormously eased if people would listen to children and young people and work with them rather than without them. Laurie, I'm coming to you as our fourth speaker again, and I want to ask you a tricky question, if I may. I think we've been talking about many different parts of the world and the differences, but also some of the commonalities. And perhaps because your project focused on 4 countries where you could get to know the context a little, I wonder if you feel it's possible to kind of draw out the calls from children and young people for change kind of different in those contexts? Or do you feel that they really did kind of say they had some similar demands despite the different parts of the world they live in?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think probably a combination of both. And it was really interesting that I think in the context, because there was a lot of differences between individual young people who were involved in the project and their peers, as well as the country differences. So although the backdrop was very different, so for example, in Lebanon, when we were talking about access to education, what was talked about in the context of being quite challenging in the UK in terms of the shift to online learning, it's a whole different level in terms of Lebanon, in terms of access to internet, sort of going down, real sort of much more infrastructural challenges going on there. And then similarly within Singapore, I think to some extent there were assumptions about digital learning being perhaps more established and more embedded. But irrespective of that, I think a lot of it really comes down to how that's activated by individual professionals, by individual schools, and some of the decisions that they're taking. So it really felt like ultimately a lot of the challenges were the same, that actually education is a right, that access to education has to be something that is negotiated between children, families, and schools, irrespective of the context. And it was where that dialogue wasn't there that things really felt down. And again, I think so the issues were the same, but I think what was also interesting was there were definitely different cultures of participation within the different countries. So within the UK, you could really get this sense that there's quite a tradition of sort of formalized organized youth groups and youth forums and movements, whereas, for example, in Italy, there really isn't the equivalent there. So when we were looking to solutions, I think in Italy, it was saying, look, one of the sort of big challenges here is really about just children and young people not being invisible in the media. We need to have a voice per se. Whereas I think in the UK, there was much more of a focus among young people around what kind of structures can we put in place, because it's really not working at the moment. We're being kept at arm's length from decision makers, from governments, and sort of kept over in a box over here. But in either scenario, I think it was, again, coming back to that message that it has to be a partnership approach. It can't just be listening to children and about their issues, that actually children are competent actors and that they have something to contribute to issues that aren't just specific to them as an age group.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's I asked you that question partly because I think it's difficult to it's crazy really to try to generalize across the world, but it is very striking how many countries and how many parts of the world these 4 projects encompass. And also, as I think you've all stressed, the very different circumstances that children live in within countries, and the situation of children who are refugees or asylum seekers, as several of you have said, is very different from those who are the relatively privileged living in the urban parts of a country. I can see some observations in the Q&A about the different circumstances from the point of view of children who perhaps have special educational needs or disabilities or facing mental health difficulties. There are so many differences. Of course, we cannot possibly encompass them all here. But I just wonder, perhaps if we take, and questions are very, very welcome in the Q&A. I'm trying to kind of synthesize them really now as we come to the last part of this webinar. I think there is really a sense of urgency from the questions, and I invite you to respond to any of them, of course, about the children who are particularly disadvantaged or particularly without the resources from their society, where perhaps we've hoped, some of us who study technology, that the technology would provide the kind of the workaround, the helping hand where society had failed, that maybe the technology could provide the means of inclusion. But I think the gist of the questions might be, is that perhaps particularly where children have been let down by the deployment of technology and the design and the possibilities of technology. So I think I might ask speakers if there's any particular question in the Q&A, which I hope you can all see. Please feel free to answer it. But my kind of general question might be, perhaps what can schools do? What can educators do? There's a lot of emphasis on educators, really to support the children who are most at need or have been most disadvantaged by COVID-19. And is technology part of that solution, or is the technology actually irrelevant to what it is that the educators could be doing? Any order, really. Sometimes we get very focused on technology, but it isn't always the number one answer. I don't know, Maya, what do you feel that the schools could be kind of better using the technology to reach the children who particularly need it, or some other priority should take precedence?
Definitely in some countries, this would solve a lot of problems. Beside then that all children should have possibility to have a device which they could use. In some countries, this was just not possible because internet is just there for the richer ones. They're the way, especially in Southeast Asia, they often got back to school television. Also, for example, in Chile. So now discovering what you can do is you can reach out and try to offer a lot of content over television, or in the countries where even television is not there, over mobile phones, so still television, or over radio. So to get very clear in these kind of situations, we have to offer content. And if we can't offer them by internet, then find the more traditional media to use it.
Yeah, I think we definitely see the full range of media be mattering, especially if not everyone has the connectivity as you have all very clearly said. But it's interesting to hear people talking about radio again, or to see in this country the BBC also provided schools programming, even though the popular view is that young people don't watch TV anymore. So we kind of use what's possible. Patricio, I know you kind of heard us from a mix of young people and young activists. What would you say about those who are kind of facing some of the most intense difficulties?
But definitely this is an issue of inequality, as an inequality in all levels of the social life. But one thing is the digital component technology. So it's clear now it's about 48% of the population of the planet have no access to internet. So we're thinking half, and most of them in the global south. So, but as well, it's not just access to internet or devices. I've been talking to children, young people from communities in Africa. They don't have even electricity. So just the chance to have even a laptop, internet connection later, is almost impossible. So it still will be this huge gap in access to technology. But children always say that if they have an access to technology, even at a community level, so an access to computer that a group of children or community can use is something that they really value. They don't see sometimes just need to have an individual possession of internet or a laptop or tablet that can be used collectively. So that is another way as well to address many of these issues. But in terms of the children and young people that I've been talking to or activists in many different issues from many countries, so even if they have all the technology, all the digital access, if they are not listened to, what is the point? It does say always this. So what's the point to go on a conference? What's the point to do a research? What's the point to go a community meeting if people don't listen to us? I think that is a major mindset change we need to have from the international community to a very community in rural areas. So we need to change that. Otherwise, children will continue being in the margin of the society. But as well, in another issue that COVID-19 evidence is the different identities, social identities that children have is affecting as well as their possibility to go out, to have a network, to communicate with others, for instance, gender, socioeconomic status, language, different sexual orientation, ethnicity, races, all these elements as well. We cannot take those out of equation in terms of the access to technology, using the information, and to be listened to. That is kind of, for me, a key part. I'm not covering many of the other rights because I know many other experts will cover that one. So my interest is to cover the right to be heard and participate, the right to have an opinion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Laurie, maybe I can see some very kind of pointed questions in the Q&A about what are the steps needed to overcome the inequalities, the digital inequalities that we've been talking about, and the way in which the digital inequalities kind of rest on underlying socioeconomic inequalities. I don't know who you're taking your research results to, as it were, on action.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I think in terms of the report that we've produced so far, I think we identified recommendations for a wide range of stakeholders. We started writing them down and realized that actually the list is huge. So there's some actions there for government and sort of national decision makers. There's also definitely some actions there for schools, particularly in the UK, because we do have a very devolved education system. A lot of differences of experiences came down to decisions that were made at a school level. So really having just really simple mechanisms in place to establish a dialogue with students around what education should look like, about what their needs are, can make a huge difference. It doesn't have to just be a top-down policy. We also had recommendations for the media, because again, I think a lot of what's been unhealthy and what's really obscured children's rights during the pandemic has been these very narrow representations, again, that really just don't give justice to children's lived experience. And that's where the project came from in the first place. We just thought, where are the young people in the coverage here? What's their contribution? Why are they not being seen as stakeholders at the table? But I also think, because there's been a focus on education, what seems to come through from young people on the project is it's not just the learning component, it's also the mental health and well-being. And actually, even during the lockdown period, it's not just about whether or not devices are there, whether connectivity is there. It's also really about what are the psychological effects of what's going on at the moment. What's happening within the family that might be difficult. And alongside all of the challenges, I think what would be a shame would be to throw away what we've learned from that experience. So that, there were the real sort of seeds of things that were promising, along the lines of, schools much more proactively engaging, having those conversations with parents, beyond just monitoring their child's education, really just calling them and saying, how are you? Are you okay? How are things in the home? How's your well-being? How are you doing? And just small things like that really, the evidence was that really wasn't happening systematically in the way that it could. So I think the big message is, yes, there's been a lot of shocks from the COVID experience, but in thinking about going back to normal and unlocking, let's not forget the positives that did come out, and the things that have really kind of perhaps forced schools and forced other stakeholders to rethink about, what kind of support is needed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Excellent. Many actions are needed from many organizations. I find myself wondering, as we kind of map out what we want from governments, media, educators, and so forth. Konstantinos, in the COVID under 19 project, the project has kind of brought together many child rights organizations and activists, and I have sometimes myself thought COVID is an interesting moment for some of them to kind of recognize, of course, they're very aware of many of the challenges children face, but they haven't always thought so much about the importance of digital technologies. And I wonder what your children's rights organizations are often the champions. What could they be saying now about digital equality, inequality, the nature of access and so forth? Would you have them prioritize it? Or not?
Definitely, I think it's a huge problem. The more it's growing, it's getting ever worse, and the more we leave it untouched. And I think that's something definitely we should look at from, because they're also very, the internet and social media and all these platforms are very powerful, and you can have a huge reach inside. And we all have seen how Greta Thunberg started from an Instagram page and how that grew to millions of children marching around the world. But I think even if we look at the more like primary source of the way that children are using the internet, and that's education. And myself, I'm a university student also. It's been mentioned in the Q&A about students with learning disabilities. I'm actually dyslexic as well. And telling from personal experience, I think I have a laptop, I have internet, so, but it's definitely a struggle, and online learning cannot replace the in-person teaching. And I think it's important that we make the return to in-person teaching, but we also keep some lessons about how we can use the internet and digital tools in general to involve more people and use these tools to make it a more anthropocentric form of education, in which children will not only learn about maths and physics, which are obviously very important, but they also learn about defending human rights, what it means to be human, music, art. And that can be more useful for also children with learning disabilities, children of minorities, children from the LGBTQ plus community. And I think it's really important if we take something out of it and use it to involve more people, even in the creation of solutions through art, through music, because that's what inspires people. It's the stories, it's the people coming together.
Brilliant. I'm aware that we have come to the end of our time, and and there are many really brilliant questions in the Q&A that we could have taken another hour over. I found myself reflecting on the poll at the start, where more in the audience felt that technology had helped young people during lockdown. And in a way, we've had a kind of depressing, but I think realistic conversation about the very many difficulties that technology has not quite helped enough with, and could help more. So we'll stop here. I very much want to thank all of our speakers. We will put links to everyone's research on the festival blog. We didn't have time to hold a new poll, but I'm wondering, maybe the answer will be a little less positive, but we've had a great call to action to improve things. So thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Watch the festival blog, participate more in the festival if you wish, and I'll say from London at least, good evening.